You don't live here anymore." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood in the doorway, with his arms crossed, blocking the hall like a stranger guarding someone else's house. Eleanor looked at him confused. "Marcus, what are you talking about?" Brittany leaned against the wall phone already in her hand recording. "We've talked about this," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. "This situation isn't healthy." "This is my home," Eleanor said quietly. "I raised you here." Marcus exhaled through his nose, impatient. "You stayed here. That doesn't mean it was yours." The words landed hard. Eleanor tightened her grip on the strap of her old handbag. It was the same one she'd carried to work for years, the leather worn, soft at the edges. "You're embarrassing yourself," Brittany added, angling the camera slightly. "We're setting boundaries. People our age don't live with parents forever." "I'm not asking to stay forever," Eleanor said. "I just need time." Marcus shook his head. "You've had time. Your whole life, actually." She stared at him, searching his face for something familiar. For the boy who used to wait up late when she worked double shifts. For the kid who cried when she missed his school play because she couldn't afford to take the night off. "I'm your mother," she said. "You adopted me," Marcus replied, "and you chose to live like this. Don't put that on me." Brittany smiled. "If you come back after today, we'll call the police." There it was. The sentence that couldn't be taken back. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She nodded once slowly and stepped back. Marcus closed the door before she could say anything else. 3 hours later, Eleanor stood in line at a grocery store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She placed a loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a small bag of apples on the counter. Nothing extra. Nothing warm. Just enough to get through the week. The cashier scanned the items and nodded toward the card reader. Eleanor slid her benefits card through her hands, steady out of habit. The machine beeped. "Declined," the cashier said flatly. Eleanor frowned. "That can't be right. Could you try again?" Another beep. Still declined. A man behind her sighed loudly. Someone else laughed. A group of younger men near the soda aisle lifted their phones. One of them whispered loudly enough for her to hear. "Look at this." Another freeloader. "Ma'am," the cashier said, already reaching for the next customer's items, "you need another form of payment." Eleanor swallowed. "I don't have one." The phones kept recording. Someone said, "This is why taxes are so high." She gathered her things slowly and stepped aside, leaving the food behind. No one stopped her. No one said a word. Outside, the air was sharp with cold. Eleanor walked until her legs ached and her chest felt tight until she found an empty park bench under a flickering street lamp. She sat down and pulled an old photo from her bag. Marcus at 7 years old, missing 2 teeth, grinning like he'd won the lottery. "I did everything right," she whispered. The night didn't answer. The next morning, Eleanor tried to stay invisible. She visited people she once helped, neighbors she cooked for when they were sick, a woman whose kids she watched for free so she could work nights. Doors opened just wide enough to see her, then closed again. "I'm sorry," one woman said, not meeting her eyes. "We're dealing with our own stuff." Another pretended not to be home. By noon, Eleanor was exhausted. She sat on a bus bench downtown, watching people rush past in pressed coats and polished shoes. She remembered cleaning offices just like the ones they worked in. Empty trash cans full of shredded documents, coffee cups from meetings where men decided the fate of thousands without lowering their voices. Back then, no one looked at her. That was the point. That afternoon, her phone buzzed. A notification. Brittany had gone live again. Eleanor didn't open it, but she could imagine the comments. Words like toxic, boundaries, grown man. She slipped the phone back into her bag. When the shelter opened that evening, she stood in line with strangers. A young woman in front of her shook from the cold. A man behind her argued with staff about paperwork. Inside, the air smelled like bleach and tired bodies. Eleanor took a thin blanket and found a cot near the wall. Later, she sat up while others slept. Her mind wouldn't slow down. She replayed Marcus's voice, calm, certain, like he'd rehearsed it. You don't live here anymore. She remembered the first night she brought him home. How small he looked. How she promised him out loud that she would never let him feel unwanted. Somewhere along the way, she had disappeared inside her own life. She had worked quietly. She had saved quietly. She had watched and learned and planned while everyone else talked. And in doing so, she had taught the world how to underestimate her. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a second phone. Older. Heavier. The kind she never used in public. She didn't turn it on yet. She just held it, feeling its weight. Across the room, the young woman from earlier was crying silently into her hands. Eleanor stood, crossed the room, and sat beside her. You're not invisible, Eleanor said gently. The woman looked up surprised. People just choose not to see, Eleanor continued. That's on them. Later that night, as the shelter lights dimmed, Eleanor lay back and stared at the ceiling. Her heart felt bruised, but her mind was clear. The mask she'd worn for decades had done its job. It had kept her safe. It had kept her unnoticed, but it had also protected people who never deserved it. Eleanor closed her eyes and made a decision she should have made long ago. Enough hiding. By the next morning, the city moved on, as if nothing had happened. Eleanor didn't. She walked through the neighborhood, slowly carrying the same old bag, her shoulders slightly hunched, not from age, but from the quiet instinct to take up less space. These were the same streets where she had shoveled snow without being asked, where she had knocked on doors with pots of soup when someone was sick, where she had sat for hours beside hospital beds because no one else could get time off work. Today, curtains shifted and then went still. One neighbor stepped outside to collect her mail, saw Eleanor, and froze. Their eyes met for a second, just long enough for recognition, before the woman looked down and turned away, pretending to be busy with envelopes she wasn't reading. Another neighbor smiled weakly and said, I'm so sorry the way people say it. When they're relieved, the problem isn't theirs. No one invited her in. No one asked where she was going to sleep. Eleanor understood something then that hurt more than Marcus's words. The betrayal hadn't started with him. It had simply been finished by him. At the bus stop downtown, two men in business coats stood nearby, laughing about a meeting. One of them glanced at Eleanor and then looked away, his smile fading just slightly, as if her presence reminded him of something he didn't want to think about. She recognized that look. She had seen it her entire working life. It was the look people gave when they believed kindness was optional. Her phone buzzed again. Messages she didn't open. Notifications she didn't need to read to understand. The video Brittany had filmed had spread faster than Eleanor ever could have imagined. Someone had added captions. Someone else had slowed down. Her silence replayed it, turned it into commentary. She chose this life, one comment read. Kids don't owe parents anything, said another. A man with thousands of followers had stitched the clip, nodding thoughtfully into the camera. This is why boundaries matter, he said. You can't save everyone. Eleanor slipped the phone back into her bag. That afternoon, she tried the library. It was warm, quiet, and free. She sat at a long table near the windows and watched people come and go. A librarian walked past her, twice, then stopped. You can stay, the woman said carefully. But if you're waiting for someone, we close at 6. I know, Eleanor replied. The woman hesitated as if she wanted to say more, then walked away. By evening, the cold had settled into Eleanor's bones. She found herself back outside the sky, already darkening the city, glowing with lights meant for people who had somewhere to be. She sat on a public bench near a busy intersection and watched traffic crawl past. Headlights flared, horns honked. Life continued loud and indifferent. A man dropped a few coins into her open bag without making eye contact. I'm not, Eleanor began, but he was already gone. That night at the shelter, intake was fast and impersonal. A clipboard, a number, a thin blanket folded with military precision. The woman behind the desk never asked how Eleanor got there, only whether she had any medical conditions. Around her, people spoke in low voices. Some argued. Some stared at the floor. Everyone seemed to carry the same invisible weight. Eleanor lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the room breathe. She thought of the grocery store again, not the declined card, but the silence. How no one had stepped forward. How easy it had been for strangers to film her pain, and how hard it had been for any of them to stop it. The next morning, she returned to the streets. At a coffee shop, she stood near the door to warm her hands. A woman behind her whispered to her friend, "She shouldn't be in here." The barista said nothing, neither did the customers. Outside, Eleanor passed a construction site. A worker offered her a bottle of water. Their eyes met, and he nodded once simply without pity. She thanked him more, moved by the respect than the gesture itself. Later, she saw her reflection in a storefront window. Tired, smaller than she remembered. Invisible in a way that felt deliberate now, not accidental. Across the street, a digital billboard flashed an advertisement about luxury condos. The slogan read, "You've earned this." Eleanor almost laughed. She walked until her feet hurt, until the city felt like it was pressing in on her from all sides. Everywhere she went, there were rules she hadn't agreed to, judgments made without evidence, conclusions drawn without curiosity. And always the same pattern. People saw her. People chose not to see her. By late afternoon, she found herself back at the park. The same bench. The same street lamp. A man walked by with his daughter holding her hand tightly. The girl looked at Eleanor and waved. Her father gently pulled her along without waving back. Eleanor watched them go. That was when she understood the full shape of what had happened. This wasn't just about a son who had turned his back. It was about a culture that measured worth by appearances and convenience, a society that praised independence until it needed compassion, a world that applauded boundaries but forgot responsibility. She sat very still, letting the realization settle. For decades, she had moved quietly through powerful spaces unseen by choice. She had believed that humility was protection, that silence was safety. But silence, she saw now, was also permission. Around her, the city hummed, alive and unconcerned. People passed by, with groceries, with briefcases, with plans for dinner, and tomorrow, and next year. No one stopped. Eleanor reached into her bag and felt the familiar weight of the phone she never used in public. She didn't turn it on yet. She didn't need to. What she needed was clarity, and she had it. The humiliation hadn't broken her. It had stripped away the last illusion she had been holding on to, that being good, being quiet, being patient would eventually be enough. She stood, adjusted her coat, and blended back into the flow of people, already thinking several steps ahead, already moving with a purpose no one around her could see. The city kept looking away. That was fine. She was done waiting for it to look back. For most of her adult life, Eleanor learned how to disappear. She wore the same pale blue uniform for years, the kind designed to blend into walls and hallways. A badge with a number, not a name. Comfortable shoes with worn soles. Gloves that hid hands roughened by work no one noticed unless it wasn't done. She cleaned buildings people dreamed of working in. Glass towers downtown. Private equity firms. Investment banks with marble lobbies and offices so quiet you could hear the air conditioning breathe. At night, after the executives went home, Eleanor moved through those spaces with a cart and a mop, emptying trash cans filled with what others considered useless. She learned quickly that trash told the truth. Financial statements tossed after meetings. Drafts of shareholder letters with handwritten edits in the margins. Internal memos printed in a rush and forgotten. She didn't steal them. She read what was already discarded, standing under fluorescent lights while the city slept. At first, she didn't understand everything, so she taught herself. She checked out books from the public library on accounting, markets, and investing. She read newspapers cover to cover. When she didn't understand a term, she wrote it down and looked it up later. She learned how to read between numbers, how to spot optimism that didn't match reality, how executives spoke one way in public and another way when they thought no one was listening. And they never thought anyone was listening. Men in tailored suits talked freely when she was in the room, their voices low but careless. They complained about regulators, about workers, about shareholders who wouldn't understand the real picture. Eleanor understood it perfectly. She noticed patterns. How confidence changed before earnings calls. How the tone in a room shifted weeks before a bad quarter was announced. How fear sounded different from strategy, even when the language tried to hide it. She started small. A few $100s here. A quiet investment there. Always through accounts that didn't carry her name. She didn't chase trends. She waited. She watched. When markets dipped and panic set in, she bought what others were desperate to sell. Once she made a mistake. Trusted the wrong recommendation. Lost more than she was comfortable admitting. That night, she sat at her kitchen table long after Marcus had gone to bed, staring at numbers on paper, reminding herself that humility mattered more than pride. She adjusted. She learned. Years passed. The balances grew slowly, then faster. Eleanor never celebrated. She never told anyone. Money, she believed, was safest when it stayed quiet. The people she worked around never noticed the change. To them, she was still just the woman who wiped fingerprints off glass and replaced empty coffee pods. They complained about her mop bucket blocking the hallway. They didn't notice how closely she listened. One night, a young man stayed late. He was sitting alone at a desk, shoulders slumped, staring at a spreadsheet like it had personally betrayed him. When Eleanor passed by, he flinched, embarrassed to be seen struggling. "Rough night?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I messed up. My manager's going to tear me apart tomorrow." She looked at the screen. She shouldn't have. She knew that. But she did. "You didn't mess up," she said after a moment. "You just trusted the wrong assumption." He blinked. "What?" She pointed to a line item. "That number doesn't belong there. It's making the whole thing look worse than it is." He stared. Then he corrected it. His shoulders dropped in relief. "My name's Peterson," he said. "Thank you." Eleanor smiled and went back to her cart. Over the years, Peterson rose. Slowly at first, then faster. He never forgot the woman who'd helped him when no one else noticed he was drowning. When he asked Eleanor how she knew so much, she shrugged. "I pay attention," she said. Eventually, she trusted him with limits, with structure, with rules she never broke. Peterson became the bridge between her quiet intelligence and the systems she refused to step into herself. By the time Marcus went off to college, Eleanor had more money than she ever imagined she would, enough to change her life completely. She didn't. She stayed in the same apartment, took the same bus, packed the same lunches. She wanted Marcus to grow up understanding work, not wealth. She wanted him to believe that dignity came from effort, not advantage. She never realized how that lesson twisted itself inside him. As her assets grew, so did her caution. She saw what money did to people who didn't respect it, how it made them louder, crueler, more careless with others. She chose a different path. There were moments, though, when she wondered if she had gone too far in hiding. When Marcus complained about money, about feeling behind his peers, about the pressure to prove himself, she told him to be patient, to work harder, to build something real. She thought she was teaching him resilience. What she was really teaching him was resentment. Now, sitting alone in the quiet after everything had fallen apart, Eleanor replayed those years with painful clarity. The choices she'd made, the conversations she'd avoided, the truths she'd kept locked away for safety. 30 years of watching power up close had taught her one thing above all else. Systems didn't change out of kindness. They changed when someone with leverage decided they had waited long enough. She pulled the second phone from her bag again and turned it on. Messages appeared instantly. Missed calls, alerts, names she hadn't seen on the screen in years. Peterson's was there. She didn't call him yet. Instead, she thought about the offices she'd cleaned, the deals she'd seen coming long before headlines caught up, the times she had chosen silence over influence because it felt safer, more moral. She understood now that morality without action was just comfort disguised as virtue. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at a city that had taken her labor and ignored her presence for decades. She had been invisible by design. Useful, quiet, easy to overlook. That invisibility had given her access. It had given her time. It had given her power she never asked for, but learned how to hold. And now it had given her clarity. The uniform had been a disguise. The work had been real. The knowledge had always been hers. Eleanor placed the phone back in her bag, her decision settling into place with the calm certainty of someone who had finally stopped pretending she didn't know her own worth. The secrets she had carried for 30 years were no longer protection. They were leverage, and she was ready to use it. The shelter had a way of stripping time down to its bare parts. Morning came without ceremony. No alarms, no urgency, just the quiet shuffling of bodies and the low hum of people bracing themselves for another day of being unseen. Eleanor sat at the edge of her cot, tying her shoes slowly, deliberately. Around her lives were being managed in minutes, coffee line, bathroom line, intake desk. She watched. She always watched. That was how she noticed Crystal. The girl couldn't have been more than 25. Too thin. Eyes alert in the way people get when they've learned the world doesn't give second chances easily. Crystal argued with a volunteer about a form, her voice tight with panic. "They told me I needed this yesterday," Crystal said. "Yesterday, I didn't have it. Today, I still don't." The volunteer sighed. Rules are rules. Eleanor stepped closer. What's the form for Crystal looked at her suspicious at first. Job placement. They say I won't qualify without a permanent address. Eleanor nodded once. You don't need an address. You need a reference and a skill they can verify. Crystal blinked. What, tell them you're looking for temp work, Eleanor said calmly. Warehouse night shifts. Ask for daily pay options. Don't mention housing unless they do. The volunteer frowned, but Crystal listened. She always would have listened. Desperation sharpens attention. Why are you helping me? Crystal asked later, when the two of them sat against the wall with paper cups of coffee. Because someone helped me once, Eleanor replied. And because this isn't the end of your story. Crystal studied her. You don't talk like people here. Eleanor smiled faintly. Neither do you. By early afternoon, Eleanor had done what she came to do. She'd given advice. She'd listened. She'd observed the same patterns she'd seen her whole life. People struggling, not because they lacked intelligence, but because systems demanded proof they were already stable before offering stability. Now came the part she hadn't planned for, but knew she had to face. The test. She sat on a bench outside the shelter and took out her second phone. Not the one she used for emergencies. The other one. The one that still held Marcus's number. She didn't call as herself. She typed a message instead, keeping the words short. Careful, believable. This is County Social Services. We're contacting you regarding Eleanor Harris. She's been admitted with complications. Surgery may be required. We need confirmation of financial responsibility. She stared at the screen before pressing send. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't manipulation. It was clarity. If there was any doubt, left any possibility that what happened was a moment of fear or pressure, this would answer it. The response came quickly. Who is this? I already told her to stop contacting me. Eleanor's chest tightened, but her hand stayed steady. There may be costs involved. She typed, We're asking if you're willing to contribute to emergency care. Several minutes passed. I'm not responsible, Marcus wrote back. She's not my legal obligation. Another message followed sharper. If this continues, I'll contact a lawyer. This is harassment. Eleanor read the words twice. That should have been enough. But then her phone buzzed again. A notification from social media. Brittany was live. Eleanor didn't open the app. She didn't need to. Someone nearby had the sound on. People really need to learn boundaries, Brittany's voice said, bright and confident. You can't let guilt control your life. Some people choose their situation. Laughter followed. Agreement. Applause in comment form. Crystal looked at Eleanor, confusion and anger mixing on her face. Are they talking about you? Eleanor didn't answer. A final message appeared on the screen. Marcus again. If she dies, that's not on me. The sentence sat there quiet and complete. Something in Eleanor shifted, not violently, not dramatically. It was the clean break of a truth finally spoken out loud. There was no misunderstanding to fix, no apology waiting to happen. The test was over. She stood and walked back inside, past the intake desk, past the rows of cots. Crystal was packing her bag. They're giving me an interview tomorrow, she said, breathless. I don't know how you knew what to say. Eleanor nodded. You'll do fine. Crystal hesitated. Are you okay? Eleanor considered the question. Then she answered honestly. Yes. That evening, as the shelter lights dimmed, Eleanor sat alone near the window. She pulled out the phone one last time, not to message Marcus, but to scroll through old contacts. There were names there she had protected for years by never using them. Peterson was one of them. She pressed call. He answered on the second ring. Eleanor, yes, she said. Her voice was calm, clear. I was wondering when I'd hear from you, Peterson said quietly. I need a car, Eleanor replied, and I need you to prepare documents. There was a pause. Not hesitation recognition? Everything he asked. Yes, she said. Everything. Outside traffic moved steadily, indifferent to the decisions being made, just beyond its noise. Inside, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Alignment. She thought of Marcus as a child asleep in the back seat while she drove home from late shifts. Of Brittany's voice, confident and careless. Of the world that had watched her fall and decided it was none of its business. She wasn't angry. She was done pretending the truth didn't matter. When she ended the call, Eleanor sat very still. The shelter around her was quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes after hope has been rationed carefully. The moral test hadn't been about money. It had been about choice. And the answers had been unmistakable. The music was loud enough to shake the walls. Marcus stood near the kitchen island glass, in hand laughing as someone congratulated him on finally cutting dead weight. Brittany moved through the room like she owned it, phone in one hand, champagne in the other, documenting the night for people who only knew them through filtered screens and confident captions. This is what growth looks like, she said to the camera. Sometimes you have to let go of what's holding you back. The doorbell rang. No one expected it. The sound cut cleanly through the noise, sharp and insistent. Marcus frowned, irritated, and nodded toward the door. Brittany rolled her eyes. I'll get it, she said. Probably another neighbor complaining. When she opened the door, the smile fell from her face. Eleanor stood on the porch, calm and still dressed simply. Behind her were two men in tailored suits and a woman holding a leather folder. A black sedan idled at the curb, its headlights steady. Brittany laughed nervously. "You can't be serious." Marcus appeared behind her. His expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief, then to anger. "What is this?" he demanded. "I told you not to come back." Eleanor looked at him, the way a stranger might, carefully without emotion. "I'm not here as your guest." One of the men stepped forward. "Marcus Harris," he said evenly. "I'm representing the legal owner of this property." Marcus scoffed. "That's impossible. This house was sold years ago." The woman with the folder interrupted. "To a holding company." She opened the folder and laid out documents on the kitchen counter, pushing aside half-empty glasses and a bowl of chips. Names, dates, signatures. The room grew quiet. Eleanor spoke softly. "I didn't inherit anything," she said. "Neither did you." Marcus's mouth opened, then closed. Brittany stepped closer to Eleanor, her voice suddenly sweet. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," she said. "We're family." Eleanor met her eyes. "Family doesn't threaten to call the police." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Marcus's face drained of color. You planned this." "No," Eleanor replied. "I prepared for it." She explained, without drama, without pleasure, how she had funded opportunities quietly. How the job Marcus bragged about had come through a recommendation that wasn't random. How the accounts that kept his career afloat had always been protected by someone he never bothered to look at twice. "You let me believe I earned it," Marcus whispered. "You did earn parts of it," Eleanor said. "What you didn't earn was your certainty that you were entitled to everything." Brittany's phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor. She reached for Eleanor's arm. "We can fix this," she said quickly. "We can talk." Eleanor stepped back. "No." Security entered quietly, professional and respectful. Guests began to leave, avoiding eye contact, the celebration dissolving into embarrassment and whispers. Marcus dropped to his knees. "I didn't mean it," he said. "I was stressed. I was trying to protect my future." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and felt no satisfaction. "Your future was never the problem," she said. "Your character was." She turned and walked out. The next months were quiet. Brittany left town with what she could carry. Her social media accounts went dark. Marcus lost everything he'd taken for granted: the job, the house, the certainty that the world would always bend for him. Through a foundation he never asked to be part of, he was placed in a custodial role at a commercial building downtown. Night shifts, long hours, cleaning offices after people went home. The work was honest. The silence was loud. One evening, Marcus watched an older woman scrub a conference room table beside him. She worked carefully, methodically, as if the surface deserved respect. Something twisted in his chest. Eleanor never came to see him. Instead, she worked. Half of her assets went into establishing the Invisible Strength Foundation, focused on protecting elderly people from abuse and creating training programs for those society had written off. The other half funded housing education and job placement with no cameras, no speeches. She returned once to the grocery store where her card had been declined. This time she walked the aisles with a clipboard and a quiet authority. The manager, who had looked past her months earlier, avoided her gaze as she spoke to staff. "Compassion isn't optional," Eleanor said. "It's policy." New leadership followed, new training, The store reopened with dignity written into every rule. One evening, Eleanor sat on the same park bench where she had once counted the hours until morning. The street lamp flickered overhead. The city moved around her, as it always had. A woman sat beside her, a stranger, tired holding a bag that looked a lot like the one Eleanor used to carry. Eleanor offered a smile. Long day. The woman nodded. Feels like no one sees me? Eleanor considered that. Then she said, They do. They just don't always understand what they're looking at. As the woman stood to leave, Eleanor remained on the bench watching the lights, the traffic, the people moving between moments of purpose and doubt. She had lost a son. She had gained clarity. And with it, a legacy built not on punishment, but on proof that dignity doesn't come from what you own, but from how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. The city didn't applaud. It didn't need to. Eleanor had stopped waiting for permission to matter. Eleanor's story does not end with wealth revealed or enemies humbled. It ends with something far quieter and far more difficult to face truth. For decades, Eleanor lived in plain sight, moving through spaces of power while being treated as if she had none. She cleaned offices where fortunes were discussed, absorbed knowledge no one thought she was capable of understanding, and built a life of discipline, restraint, and foresight. She chose humility not because she lacked strength, but because she believed character mattered more than recognition. In doing so, she protected others, gave silently, and asked for very little in return. But silence has a cost. When Eleanor was cast out by the very son she raised, it wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was the final proof that goodness without boundaries can be mistaken for weakness. Her public humiliation at home, in the grocery store, on social media, revealed a painful truth about the world we live in. People are quick to judge, quick to record, and slow to care. Society did not rush to defend her dignity. It looked away. What makes Eleanor's journey powerful is not the money she accumulated, but the restraint she exercised. When faced with cruelty, she did not respond with rage. When given the chance for revenge, she chose accountability instead. Even when her son failed the final moral test, refusing help, denying responsibility, Eleanor did not destroy him. She removed the illusion that had protected his entitlement and allowed life itself to teach the lesson she no longer could. Her legacy is not a bank balance. It is a system changed, a foundation built, and a standard set. Eleanor used her resources to protect the vulnerable, to reform institutions that once dismissed her, and to prove that dignity is not granted by status, but revealed by behavior. She did not demand applause. She did not need validation. She simply stopped hiding. So what can we learn from this story? First, never confuse humility with invisibility. Being quiet does not mean you are powerless, but if you never speak when it matters, others may decide your value for you. Second, pay attention to how you treat people when you believe they have nothing to offer you. Character is revealed not in moments of gain, but in moments of perceived inconvenience. Third, boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. Eleanor did not lose her humanity. When she drew the line, she reclaimed it. And finally, understand this wealth can be taken, status can disappear, and approval can vanish overnight. But wisdom, discipline, and integrity compound over time. They cannot be stripped away by public opinion or personal betrayal. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, then it has done its job. If you believe stories like this matter, stories about dignity, accountability, and quiet strength, then support the channel by subscribing. It helps us continue sharing narratives that go deeper than headlines and stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Your support keeps these stories alive, and the next one may speak directly to you.